My mother pinned a white corsage to my sister's dress in the center of the reception hall, in front of 212 guests, then looked at my dress blues and laughed. A soldier, how embarrassing. I said nothing. I kept my rank a secret for 6 more years, until my sister's fiancé stepped back from me, at that same wedding, eyes wide, and said, "Salute her. We call her Admiral." If you're watching this from a base, a ship, or a place nobody back home has heard of, tell me where in the comments, then like and subscribe, because what happened in that courtroom is the reason I stopped explaining myself to people who never asked a single real question about my service. There were 3 things hanging over my life that I did not speak about at that wedding, and I am going to open all 3 before I close any of them. The first was a folder. Thin, sealed, stamped secret/no fawn, sitting in a safe deposit box at Navy Federal on Sycamore Street, containing the after-action report from an operation the Navy still would not fully declassify, 7 years after it happened, an operation that would eventually decide whether I kept my own son. The second was a marriage that looked, from the outside, like a win for a woman like me, a hedge fund husband, a house in McLean with a circular driveway, a mother-in-law who wrote checks to the Kennedy Center, and looked, from the inside, like something I was slowly being erased from. The third was a question that had been sitting under my ribs since I was 9 years old. And my mother told a room full of relatives that my father's Purple Heart was just something men do to get attention. When would the truth about who I actually was finally cost the people who dismissed me something real? I want to tell you how all 3 of those loops closed, because I think you'll recognize somebody in this story, maybe even yourself. My name is Elena Vasquez Cross. In March of the year my sister Camille got married, I was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy. 6 years into a career my family believed consisted of filing paperwork at a desk in Norfolk. That was the story my mother, Diane Vasquez, told her book club, her hairdresser, and eventually a Fairfax County family court judge. The truth was that I had spent 4 of those 6 years assigned to a joint medical evacuation task force, supporting naval special warfare operators, in theaters I was not permitted to name at Thanksgiving dinner. I coordinated trauma logistics under fire. I made triage calls that decided which wounded man got airlifted first when there were only 2 seats on the helicopter and 3 men bleeding out on the tarmac. I do not say this to impress you. I say it because my own mother thought I typed memos for a living, and she was not shy about saying so, loudly, at her younger daughter's wedding, while I stood 11 feet away in a uniform with a Bronze Star ribbon she had never once asked me about. The wedding is where this really starts, so let me put you inside it. The Fairview Manor Ballroom in Alexandria, Virginia, 2nd Saturday of March, 212 guests, $4,200 in white peonies. Camille was 26, radiant, marrying a management consultant named Tyler Renner. I flew in from Naval Station Norfolk on a 48-hour leave, still carrying the exhaustion of a woman who had, 6 days earlier, stood in a field hospital tent in a place I cannot name and watched a 19-year-old corpsman die on a table because the blood we needed didn't arrive in time. I wore my dress blues because my sister asked me to, because some stupid, hopeful part of me thought that was an invitation to finally be seen. My mother pinned the corsage to Camille's dress at the center of the room, under the chandelier, and made a toast about how proud she was of her daughter for choosing a real career, a real partner, a real life. Then her eyes landed on me, on the ribbons on my chest that she had never once asked the meaning of, and she said the line that would echo through the next 6 years of my life. And this one, a soldier. How embarrassing. I keep telling people she's in HR. The room laughed. Not cruelly, just easily, the way rooms laugh when they've been given permission by someone with authority over the story. My future brother-in-law, Tyler, laughed too, that night. He would not always. I did not correct her. I want you to understand that this was already an old habit by then. Not a single moment of cowardice, but the accumulated residue of a lifetime. When I was 14 and made the honor roll, my mother asked why I couldn't be more like Camille, more social. When I enlisted at 19, instead of pledging a sorority at James Madison University like my sister, my mother told the extended family I was going through something. When I was commissioned as an officer after finishing my degree through the Navy, she told her sister I had settled for the military because nothing else worked out. Correcting her in front of 212 people at Camille's wedding would have required a version of confrontation I had spent 30 years training myself out of, because in my family, correcting my mother in public was treated as a worse crime than whatever she'd gotten wrong. So I smiled. I drank a glass of champagne I didn't want, and 3 tables over, I watched a man named Marcus Whitfield, 31 years old at the time, a rising associate at a private equity firm called Ashford Vale Partners, watch me not correct my own mother, and decide, I would later understand, that I was exactly the kind of woman who wouldn't cause him trouble. Marcus was Tyler's college roommate, seated at our table because of some logistical accident in the seating chart, and by the end of the night he had asked for my number in a way that felt, at the time, like the first thing that had happened to me in years, that had nothing to do with my mother's approval. 18 months later, we were married in a much smaller ceremony that my mother nonetheless called a real wedding. Finally, someone in this family doing it right. A sentence she said within earshot of me, at my own reception, without apparent irony. I want to walk you through the 11 years of the marriage that followed, because the pattern that would eventually explode in a Fairfax County courtroom did not appear overnight. It was built, brick by brick, the same way my mother's diminishment of me was built, by people who found it more convenient to have a smaller version of me in the room than the real one. Marcus's mother, Margaret Whitfield, a woman who sat on the board of 2 private foundations and referred to her son's law degree from Georgetown as though it were a peerage, made her opinion of my career clear within the first month I met her. The military is a wonderful thing for people who need structure, she told me over a dinner at the Whitfield house in Great Falls, in front of Marcus, in front of his father, while I was, at that point, a lieutenant commander running medical logistics for a task force whose casualty numbers she would never be cleared to know. Marcus tells me you do administrative work. Very organized, I'm sure. I said, something like that. Margaret smiled the particular smile of a woman who has just confirmed something she already believed about you, and reached for the wine. That was Margaret's trait, the one thing about her that never changed across 11 years. Contempt delivered as compliment. Superiority wearing the mask of warmth. She never once raised her voice at me. She never needed to. She would say things like, "It's so nice that you have something to keep you busy while Marcus builds his career," in a tone so gentle that objecting to it would have made me the aggressor. She said a version of it the year I received orders to a classified assignment I couldn't discuss. An assignment Margaret described to her garden club as Elena taking some time for herself. My own promotions became, inside that house, a kind of inconvenience to be managed, rather than a milestone to be honored. When I made commander, 5 years into the marriage, his father raised a glass at a family dinner and toasted Marcus's incredible year at Ashford Vale, a year in which Marcus had, in fact, lost the firm's second-largest client and been quietly moved off the deal team, a fact I only learned much later. Nobody toasted me. When I mentioned, lightly, that I'd just made commander, Margaret said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," in the tone people use for a child's finger painting, and turned the conversation back to Marcus's quarter. I want to be precise about the money, because money is where this story eventually turns. By the 10th year of our marriage, I was a commander with 16 years of total service, earning base pay of roughly $11,400 a month before allowances, with a service record that included 2 Bronze Stars, a Meritorious Service Medal, and a security clearance, so far above what my own family understood, that I was legally barred from confirming or denying most of what I actually did between the ages of 28 and 34. Marcus, meanwhile, had been quietly asked to leave Ashford Vale Partners in year 9 after a compliance review found irregularities in how he'd represented fund performance to clients, a fact he did not tell me for 4 months, during which he left the house every morning in a suit and came home with stories about a difficult deal. By the time I learned the truth, he had run through nearly $200,000 of what I believed was our joint savings, funneling it into personal trading accounts and, I'd later learn in court, into an apartment in Arlington kept in the name of a woman named Jessica Hale. I found out about the job loss on a Tuesday in October, the same week I received notice that my next set of orders would involve a permanent change of station, and separately, the same week I began experiencing a symptom I had been quietly managing for almost a year. A searing pain down the left side of my spine that I had been attributing to age and bad mattresses, and that a Navy flight surgeon would eventually trace to 2 compressed vertebrae. The physical legacy of a halo insertion gone wrong during an operation I still cannot name in full in this video. An operation whose classified designation was Nightfall Cove. I need you to sit with that word for a moment, because it becomes the hinge of everything that follows. Nightfall Cove. I was the senior medical logistics officer attached to a joint task force, and on the second night of that operation, an insertion team came under fire during an extraction that went sideways over open water. And I made the call, against a superior officer's initial hesitation, to divert 2 overloaded aircraft to a forward surgical point I had built 11 hours earlier on my own initiative. A decision a formal after-action review would later credit with saving 41 wounded and injured personnel. I walked away with 2 compressed vertebrae, a torn labrum in my right hip, and, though I did not admit it for almost 2 years, a diagnosis of chronic, service-connected post-traumatic stress disorder. The VA would eventually rate my combined disability at 70%, entitling me to $2,041 a month, on top of a pension I would begin drawing the moment I formally retired. I am telling you all of this financial and medical detail now, plainly, without embarrassment, because 6 years after that wedding, a lawyer standing 8 feet away from me, in a Fairfax County courtroom, would stand up and tell a judge that every part of it was a lie. Let me close the gap in time for you. The year I turned 34, 3 things happened within 11 weeks of each other, and together they became the fuse. First, I received my official retirement processing date, 18 months out, the start of the medical board process that would formally separate me after 17 years of service, on the basis of my spine and hip. Second, at a follow-up appointment at Portsmouth Naval Medical Center, I collapsed in the hallway outside the orthopedic clinic, a genuine, medically documented syncopal episode that put me in an observation bed for 6 hours. A treating physician, Commander Aisha Reyes, would later describe under oath as consistent with a woman managing real, worsening service-connected injury, not consistent, in any respect, with malingering. Third, 11 days later, I came home 4 hours early and found my husband's phone open on the counter, a text thread with Jessica Hale still on the screen, reading that he was just waiting for the medical retirement to go through. Then we file, before her disability payout complicates the numbers. I stood in my own kitchen, in the house we owned together on Cobblestone Lane, and read that sentence 3 times. I did not throw anything. I did not scream. I want you to notice that about me now, because it is going to matter later, in a courtroom, when a man's lawyer tries to tell 12 strangers and a judge that a woman who reacts to catastrophe by going quiet and precise must be hiding something, rather than a woman who spent 17 years being trained to keep her hands steady while everything around her was on fire. I filed for divorce first. That surprised Marcus, I think, more than anything else that happened in the following year. He had built, it would come out later, an entire strategy around the assumption that I would be too depleted, too fragile, in his lawyer's eventual word, to fight him on anything. I retained a civilian family law attorney initially, a competent but unremarkable woman named Paula Hutchins, and for the first 4 months the case moved the way most divorces move. Disclosures, appraisals, a custody evaluator assigned to assess arrangements for our son Nathaniel, who was 8 years old at the time and who, I should say plainly, is the actual center of everything I am telling you. More than the money, more than my mother, more than any medal I have ever been issued. It was Marcus's mother, Margaret, who escalated things, in the particular way she'd always operated, through gentle, devastating suggestion, rather than open aggression. In a deposition 8 months into the case, under questioning from my attorney about the family's financial history, Margaret Whitfield said, referring to me, with that same warm, contemptuous smile she'd worn at every dinner for 11 years. I've always found it curious how convenient Elena's condition became right as the divorce started. She's a strong woman. Strong women don't just collapse in hallways. I think we all know what this is really about. When my attorney asked her to clarify what she meant, Margaret said, without hesitation, "In a transcript I have read more times than I can count. She's faking it. She was never a real soldier, you understand. She did paperwork, and now suddenly she's disabled the exact month it benefits her most." That sentence, "she's faking it, she was never a real soldier," would travel from that deposition transcript into Marcus's own court filings, into his lawyer's opening arguments, and eventually, inverted, into the mouth of a two-star admiral on the witness stand. Marcus's second escalation came through his lawyer, a man named Bradley Sinclair, a partner at a Tyson's Corner firm, known for aggressive, made-for-cameras family law litigation, the kind of attorney who wore pocket squares to custody hearings, and had, according to his firm's own marketing materials, never lost a case he decided to fight publicly. Sinclair's fixed trait, across every hearing, every filing, every hallway exchange for the next year, was a kind of performed professional arrogance, a man who treated a courtroom like a stage he had been generously invited to headline. In his first major filing, Sinclair argued that my VA disability rating had been opportunistically timed, that my PTSD diagnosis was self-reported and unverifiable, and that my vague, unspecified military career, which the petitioner has repeatedly declined to detail, raises legitimate questions about her fitness, both financial and psychological, for primary custody. He requested that I be evaluated by an independent psychiatrist of the court's choosing before any custody determination could be made, and he requested, separately, that my full VA disability payments be classified as marital property subject to division, despite federal law generally protecting VA disability compensation from that exact kind of division, a legal fact Sinclair's filing simply omitted, betting, correctly, that a family court judge without a military law background might not catch the error on a first read. The third escalation, the one that finally moved me from Paula Hutchins to a different kind of lawyer entirely, came from Jessica Hale herself. Jessica was 30, a marketing director Marcus had met 2 years into our marriage, and her fixed trait across this story was a cold, calculating opportunism dressed as romantic inevitability. She was not simply a woman Marcus had an affair with. She was, the forensics would eventually show, an active architect of the plan to extract as much of the marital estate as possible before I could formally retire and lock in my full pension and disability protections. In month 9, Jessica filed her own motion to intervene in the custody portion of the case, arguing that she should be granted recognized caregiver status for Nathaniel, on the basis that Marcus's Arlington apartment represented a more stable psychological environment than mine. In her affidavit, she wrote that I had prioritized an unclear and undisclosed military career over consistent parenting for years, a sentence that would have been almost funny if it hadn't been aimed at the custody of my own son. I want to pause here and tell you about the folder, because this is where the mechanism I mentioned at the start finally starts moving. When Sinclair began questioning whether my service record even existed as I claimed, I made a call I'd put off for 2 years, to Rear Admiral Harold Voss, retired, who had commanded the task force during Nightfall Cove and had become something between a mentor and a second father to me. Voss told me, in a call I took sitting on my closet floor so Nathaniel wouldn't hear, that the after-action report from Nightfall Cove had recently cleared partial declassification, 7 years out, the standard timeline, and that he would personally request expedited release of the unclassified portions for use in a civil proceeding. He also told me something I hadn't known, that he'd submitted a formal statement into my permanent record years earlier, describing the Nightfall Cove decision in his own words, sealed in my file, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. That was the Pasta Lacrada, the sealed folder, sitting first in Admiral Voss's custody, and then, 3 weeks later, in a manila envelope on the desk of my new attorney, a woman named Commander Sarah Kim, retired Navy JAG, who had transitioned to civilian family law practice, specifically to represent service members and veterans in cases exactly like mine. I switched to Sarah on the recommendation of a friend from my Naval Academy days, a former corpsman named Marisol Ortega, who had served 2 deployments beside me, and who, throughout this entire ordeal, was the person who sat with me on my kitchen floor at 11 at night, who did not need me to perform strength for her, who simply said, more than once, "You already survived worse than this. You just don't get to pretend it wasn't hard while you do it." Marisol never appeared in a courtroom. She didn't need to. She held the parts of me that didn't belong in front of a judge. Sarah Kim looked at Sinclair's filings, Margaret's deposition, Jessica's affidavit, and did what Paula Hutchins had been too cautious to do. She went on offense. She subpoenaed Marcus's full financial records going back 6 years, not just the joint accounts he'd disclosed, and retained a forensic accountant named Priya Nataraj, who specialized in hidden asset tracing. Within 5 weeks, Priya's team found the second half of the mechanism, a pattern of 11 transfers over 3 years, totaling $341,000, moved from our joint brokerage account into a personal account, and from there into the Arlington apartment and a joint account he shared with Jessica Hale. Worse, a review of the mortgage refinance on our Cobblestone Lane house turned up a signature granting Marcus authority over a home equity line of credit, a signature I had never made. A handwriting analyst, Dr. Franklin O.C., would later testify it showed clear indicators of forgery, an unnatural pause in the pen stroke, exactly where my genuine signature typically flows without lifting. I remember the exact moment Sarah told me about the forged signature, a Thursday afternoon in her Fairfax conference room, coffee going cold in front of me. She slid the forensic report across the table and said, "He forged your name on a $200,000 line of credit. This isn't a divorce anymore. This is fraud." I did not cry. I know some of you are waiting for the moment I break, and it did not come then, and it would not come in the courtroom either. What I felt was something colder and more useful than grief. The same focused clarity I remembered from the second night of Nightfall Cove. I looked at Sarah and said, "Then we go to trial. All of it. In front of a judge, in a room Marcus's mother can sit in." If you've ever had a moment like that, where the fear just runs out and something colder and steadier takes its place, tell me in the comments, because that feeling is the reason I'm able to tell you the rest of this story with a steady voice instead of a shaking one. And if this story is doing anything for you right now, hit like and subscribe, because the next part is the part where all 3 of those doors finally start opening at once, and I don't want you to miss where they land. The final hearing was scheduled for the 2nd week of June, 14 months after Marcus's text on the kitchen counter, in courtroom 4C of the Fairfax County Circuit Court, before the Honorable Judge Patricia Ainsworth, known for being exacting about evidence and intolerant of theatrics. The gallery held more people than I expected. My brother James had flown in from Chicago. Marisol sat 2 rows back in her Veterans Organization polo shirt, and Rear Admiral Harold Voss, subpoenaed as a fact witness, sat in the front row in civilian clothes, his posture unmistakably that of a man who had spent 30 years standing at attention, even when nobody told him to. Sinclair opened aggressively, exactly as I'd been warned he would. He stood, buttoned his jacket with a small theatrical flourish, and told Judge Ainsworth this was a simple story about a marriage that ended when one party's manufactured victimhood became more convenient than honesty. He said my disability rating was curiously timed, my PTSD diagnosis resting on self-reported symptoms from a career the petitioner has consistently, suspiciously, refused to detail. He gestured toward me, in a line I watched Margaret nod along to from the gallery. She did administrative and logistical work, filing, scheduling, and now, conveniently, at the exact moment her marriage and career are both ending, she is a wounded warrior. We ask this court to see through that performance. I sat perfectly still while he said it. 17 years of training does that to you. I felt Sarah's hand rest briefly, lightly, on the table between us. Not a comfort gesture exactly, more of a signal. Not yet, Hold, we're not there yet. Sarah called Dr. Franklin Osei first, and his testimony on the forged signature took 11 minutes. Methodical, devastating in its plainness. She called Priya Nataraj next, and the forensic accountant walked the court through the 11 transfers, the $341,000, the account opened in Jessica Hale's name, 6 weeks before the filing, in a voice as flat as a bank statement. Sinclair objected 11 times. Judge Ainsworth overruled him 9 of those 11, and I watched something in Margaret's posture in the gallery begin, almost imperceptibly, to change. Then Sarah called Commander Aisha Reyes, my treating physician, who testified about the syncopal episode at Portsmouth, the compressed vertebrae, the labral tear, a PTSD diagnosis built on documented clinical criteria, and 18 months of treatment records, not, as Sinclair implied, on my own unverified word. In 17 years of practice, Reyes told the court, I have seen malingering. This was not that. This was a woman who waited 2 years too long to ask for help, because she'd spent her entire career being the person other people needed to be strong. And then Sarah called Rear Admiral Harold Voss. I need to slow down here, because this was the moment the courtroom changed shape. Admiral Voss walked to the witness stand in a plain grey suit, no uniform, was sworn in, and Sarah asked him to state his rank and his relationship to the case. I commanded Joint Task Force Cormorant during the operation designated Nightfall Cove, he said, and Lieutenant Commander, now Commander, Elena Vasquez Cross, served as the Senior Medical Logistics Officer under my command during that operation. Sarah handed him the folder, the recently declassified after-action report, and asked him to summarize the events of the operation's second night. Admiral Voss described it without embellishment, the way men like him always do, which somehow makes it land harder. He described the insertion team taking fire during an extraction over open water. He described 2 overloaded evacuation aircraft with wounded aboard, and no clear forward medical point. He described a junior officer, me, making an independent, unauthorized call to divert both aircraft to a forward surgical station she had built on her own initiative 11 hours earlier, against his own initial hesitation on the radio. He described the outcome, 41 wounded and injured personnel, who reached surgical care in time because of that decision. He described the injuries I sustained that same night, documented in a medical evacuation record, entered as evidence, compressed vertebrae, a torn labrum, the specific, physical, undeniable cost of the decision that saved 41 lives. Then Sarah asked him the question I know she had been saving. Admiral Voss, opposing counsel, and members of the respondent's family have characterized the petitioner's military service as, quote, filing and scheduling, and have suggested her injuries and diagnosis are fabricated for financial advantage. Based on your first-hand command of this operation, what is your response to that characterization? Admiral Voss looked, not at Sarah, not at the judge, but directly at Margaret Whitfield in the gallery, and said, she was never faking it. I've heard people say that about her before, in this case, in my presence, and I want to say clearly, under oath, that it is false. She was never a soldier who filed paperwork. She was the officer who made the single decision that kept 41 American service members alive, on a night I have relived more times than I can count. If anyone in this room owes an apology for what they've said about who she is, it isn't her. Salute her, if you know what's good for you. That is the only appropriate response to what this woman actually did. I watched Margaret Whitfield's face when he said it. I watched the exact muscle movement of a woman realizing, in real time, in front of 40 strangers, and her own son's lawyer, that the sentence she'd built her entire deposition around, she's faking it, she was never a real soldier, had just been read back to her, inverted, by a 2-star admiral, under oath, in open court. I did not smile. I did not need to. Sinclair tried to recover on cross, suggesting heroism years ago didn't preclude fabricated symptoms today, and Voss simply said, Counselor, I have commanded wounded service members for 3 decades. I know malingering when I see it, and I know real injury when I see it, and what I have watched this woman endure, in this operation and in this courtroom, is the second thing. Judge Ainsworth, I noticed, wrote something down at that exact moment and underlined it twice. Marcus took the stand last, on his own attorney's insistence, and it went worse for him than Sinclair had planned. Under Sarah's cross-examination, confronted with the forged signature and the forensic timeline of transfers to Jessica Hale, Marcus's composure, the same easy confidence that first drew me to him across a wedding reception table, simply came apart. He admitted, haltingly, first to the account transfers, then, after a long silence Judge Ainsworth did not fill, to signing my name on the home equity line of credit himself. I didn't think it would matter, he said. I thought we'd work it out before it came up. Judge Ainsworth's response was quiet and exact. Mr. Whitfield, forging your spouse's signature on a financial instrument is not a marital miscommunication. It is a matter I am required to refer to the appropriate authorities, regardless of the outcome of this proceeding. Judge Ainsworth's ruling, delivered from the bench that same afternoon, was the kind of moment some of you are hoping I'll describe with more triumph than I actually felt. What I felt, sitting at that table, was mostly a very deep, very old tiredness, finally being allowed to set down its weight. She granted me primary physical custody of Nathaniel, citing a clear and troubling pattern of financial deception and character disparagement on the part of the respondent's family, rather than any deficiency in the petitioner. She ruled my VA disability compensation was federally protected and would not be divided as marital property, consistent with law Sinclair's filing had conveniently misstated. She ordered a full accounting and equitable division of the concealed $341,000, weighted substantially in my favor given the forgery finding. And she denied Jessica Hale's motion for caregiver status, noting from the bench that an individual who was an active party to concealing marital assets has no standing to be recognized as a stabilizing presence in this child's life. If you've ever watched the people who spent years underestimating you finally run out of places to stand, you know there isn't a triumphant orchestra swell waiting on the other side. There's just quiet. Sarah squeezed my hand under the table. Marisol was crying 2 rows back, which was strange, because I wasn't. I looked at Margaret, and for the first time in 11 years, she would not meet my eyes. The months after the ruling brought their own separate, individualized reckonings, and I think it matters to tell you what happened to each person, because the point was never simply that I won. Jessica Hale's marketing firm, upon learning of the fraud referral, quietly let her go within 6 weeks, and the Arlington apartment lease turned out to be in Marcus's name alone, meaning she lost the job and the apartment in the same season. Bradley Sinclair's firm faced an ethics inquiry over the misstatement of federal VA disability protections in his filing, an inquiry that did not end his career, but did end, for a while, his run of headline-friendly custody cases. Margaret Whitfield's garden club and charitable board circles absorbed the story of the forged signature with the particular silent cruelty of communities that don't confront you, they simply stop inviting you. She resigned from one foundation board within the year. She did not attend Nathaniel's next birthday party. My mother, notably, did. That last part is the one I still turn over the most. Diane Vasquez, who laughed at my uniform in front of 212 people, who spent 30 years calling my service a hobby, sat in that courtroom gallery for the ruling, having flown up from Florida after Camille finally told her what the case was actually about. What she said, 3 weeks later, standing in my kitchen while Nathaniel did homework at the table, was smaller and harder than an apology. I didn't ask, because asking would have meant admitting I should have asked years ago. I have not entirely forgiven her, not in the clean way. Movies wrap these things up. But she asks about my work now. It is not everything. It is something, and after 34 years, something is not nothing. Marcus reached out without a lawyer, copied on the email 9 months after the ruling, asking to see Nathaniel more consistently under the structured terms Judge Ainsworth had set. I agreed, because Nathaniel's relationship with his father is not mine to sabotage out of a grievance that, however earned, is mine to carry, not his. He wrote one sentence I have thought about often since. I spent years assuming the version of you that was easiest for me to live with was the whole truth, and I never once asked what I was missing. It did not undo the forgery, or the affair, or 11 years of being talked over at his mother's table, but it was the first fully honest thing he ever said to me. I retired formally from the United States Navy the following spring, 17 years, 4 months, and 11 days of service, at a small ceremony at Naval Station Norfolk, attended by Admiral Voss, by Marisol, by my brother James, by Nathaniel in a small borrowed uniform jacket, and, quietly, from the back row, by my mother. I stood at the podium in my dress blues, the same uniform my mother once called embarrassing, in front of 212 strangers. And I did not give a long speech. I said this, that the hardest part of my career was never the injuries, and it was never the classified operations, and it was never even that divorce. The hardest part was spending 3 decades being told, by the people who were supposed to know me best, that what I carried quietly did not count, because I did not perform it loudly. I hoped every quiet person in that room, whose sacrifices got filed under paperwork, because nobody bothered to ask, would understand that being underestimated is not the same as being small. I think about that wedding sometimes, the corsage, the laughter, the 212 guests who watched my mother diminish me and said nothing, and I think about Tyler's face, years later, when he finally understood what he'd laughed along with that night. I don't hold it against him anymore. Most people don't ask real questions about the quiet ones in their family, not because they're cruel, but because it's easier not to, until the day it isn't, until the day the folder opens, until the day someone finally stands up in a courtroom and says the sentence out loud that should have been said at a wedding reception years earlier. Salute her. We call her Admiral. And if you've ever waited years for someone to finally ask you the right question, I think you already know exactly how long that wait can feel, and exactly how quiet you go while you're carrying it. There's a second folder I haven't opened yet, one Voss mentioned only once, in passing, outside that courtroom, about a promotion board and a phone call from the Pentagon I still haven't fully explained to my own family, and if you want to know what was inside that call, and what my mother said when she finally heard it, subscribe now, because you've already sat through the hardest parts of this story with me.